The man stood calmly at the customs counter, passport open, eyes steady, as if there were nothing unusual about what was happening. The airport around him hummed with the familiar sounds of mid-century travel. Footsteps echoing on polished floors, papers shuffling, low conversations in several languages. But when the immigration officer glanced down at the document in his hands, the rhythm of that room quietly broke. The passport was real. Not counterfeit, not crude. It bore the marks of long use, stamps, creases, the subtle wear of someone who traveled often. The issuing country was listed clearly, confidently. Taured. The officer frowned. He had never heard of such a country. No one he called over had either. And yet, according to the man now waiting patiently on the other side of the desk, Taured was not only real, it had existed for over 1,000 years. And here is the detail that has kept this story alive for decades. When officials showed the man a map and pointed out that no such nation existed, the man did not panic. He laughed gently and pointed to a place between France and Spain. "Andorra," he said, puzzled. "That is Taured." That single contradiction, a man carrying documents from a country that does not exist, insisting with absolute certainty that it does, is the thread that runs through everything that follows. Pull it too hard, and the story unravels. Ignore it, and the mystery deepens. This is the story of the man from Taured, and the deeper we go, the less certain it becomes whether this was a hoax, a misunderstanding, a psychological episode, or something far stranger. The earliest widely circulated version of this story places us in 1954, at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. Japan was emerging from the shadow of war, its borders reopening, its airports becoming gateways again rather than barricades. Into this moment walked a European-looking businessman, dressed neatly, speaking fluent Japanese and several other languages. Nothing about him raised suspicion until customs reviewed his paperwork. His passport looked legitimate. The stamps were consistent with international travel. The visas were correct. The airline tickets matched his itinerary. Even his currency, reportedly a mix of European money, appeared authentic. Except for the country. Taured. When questioned, the man appeared genuinely confused. He explained that Taured was located in Europe, bordering Spain and France. He claimed it had been there for centuries. When officials insisted no such nation existed, he reportedly grew frustrated. Not defensive, not evasive, but baffled, as though the officials were the ones denying reality. At this point, depending on which version you read, the story begins to split, and that split is important. Some accounts say officials escorted him to a holding room while they investigated. Others claim he was placed in a nearby hotel under guard. Almost all versions agree on what comes next. The man vanished. No signs of forced exit, no records of departure, no explanation. And so the contradiction returns. If this was a fraud, why disappear? And if this was a mistake, how did every trace of him vanish so cleanly? To understand how this story took on a life of its own, we need to slow down and examine what can actually be verified and where the fog rolls in. Here's the uncomfortable truth. There is no primary, official Japanese record confirming this incident. No archived police report, no immigration log publicly released, no contemporary newspaper article from 1954 documenting a man from Taured. The earliest written versions appeared decades later, often in books and magazines devoted to strange phenomena. Jacques Bergier and Colin Wilson, writers known for blending speculative ideas with historical oddities, helped popularize similar accounts in the 1960s and 70s. Over time, the details shifted, sharpened, and grew more cinematic. That doesn't automatically mean the story is false. It does mean we are working with layers of retelling rather than a single fixed event. And yet the persistence of specific details is curious. The location between France and Spain. The confidence of the man. The authentic-looking passport. The disappearance. These elements recur again and again, even as dates, names, and settings change. Which brings us to Andorra. Andorra is a tiny principality nestled between France and Spain. Exactly where the man insisted, Taured existed. It's old, predating many modern European states. It has a unique political status, co-ruled by the President of France and a Spanish bishop. For much of the 20th century, it was obscure enough that many people, especially outside Europe, had never heard of it. Some skeptics argue that this is the entire mystery, a confused traveler, perhaps with outdated documents, or a misunderstanding of geography, insisting on a name no longer in use. But here's the problem. There is no historical record of Andorra ever being called Taured. Not in French, Not in Spanish, not in Latin, not in any recognized medieval map. So where does the name come from? Some have pointed out that Taured resembles Tuareg, the name of a nomadic people in North Africa. Others suggest it could be a phonetic misunderstanding, a misheard or mistranslated word passed down through retellings. But even if the name were misunderstood, the passport remains a sticking point. According to the story, it wasn't dismissed as fake. It was considered valid, at least initially. Which raises a question that keeps resurfacing like a ghost refusing to stay buried. How convincing would a fake passport have needed to be in 1954 to fool officials? The answer is not as difficult as we might assume. Post-war passport standards were inconsistent. Many countries used paper documents with minimal security features. Forgery, while illegal, was far easier than today. A skilled forger could create a document that would pass casual inspection, especially if the issuing country was obscure. But again, that explanation alone doesn't account for the man's behavior. Most con artists avoid scrutiny. This man invited it, he argued. He insisted. He appeared genuinely offended that his country's existence was being questioned. Which leads us into psychological explanations. One possibility is confabulation, a condition in which a person sincerely believes false memories or constructed realities. Another is dissociative identity, or delusional disorder, where a fabricated identity feels utterly real to the person experiencing it. There are documented cases of individuals inventing entire personal histories, complete with detailed geography, politics, and timelines, not to deceive, but because their minds have constructed an internally consistent world. If that were the case here, then Taured may have existed only in the man's mind. But then comes the disappearance. If he was detained, even briefly, there should have been a record. If he escaped, how? If he was released, why is there no trace of his identity under any other name? The story's supporters argue that this is where conventional explanations start to strain. And this is where the most speculative theories emerge. Some believe the man from Taured was evidence of parallel universes, a traveler from a reality almost identical to ours, except for one small divergence: the existence of Taured instead of Andorra. This idea draws on real scientific concepts, though often stretched beyond their intended scope. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests that multiple realities could exist simultaneously, branching from different outcomes. However, there is no evidence that humans can move between them, accidentally or otherwise. Still, the appeal is obvious. It explains the man's confidence, his confusion, his certainty. It frames the disappearance not as an escape, but as a return. Others suggest time travel. Perhaps Taured existed in the past, a forgotten microstate erased by treaties and wars. But again, no historical evidence supports this. European borders have shifted endlessly, but Taured does not appear in any serious record. Another theory proposes intelligence, testing a Cold War-era psychological experiment conducted by Japanese or foreign agencies, testing responses to contradictions and authority. But no documentation has surfaced to support such a program. Each theory answers one question and creates three more. And so the contradiction returns again. The story feels too detailed to be pure fiction and too unsupported to be fact. At this point, it's worth pausing not to resolve anything, but to acknowledge why stories like this endure. They exploit a fragile assumption we all carry, that the world is fixed, mapped, and known, that borders are solid, that nations don't simply not exist. The man from Taured asks a quieter, more unsettling question. How much of reality do we accept simply because it's agreed upon? And if you're enjoying this investigation so far, we'd be grateful if you'd like the video, share it with someone who loves mysteries like this, and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep explorations like this going. Now let's return to the timeline. Later versions of the story move the setting from Tokyo to other airports, sometimes in Europe, sometimes unspecified. The year shifts from 1954 to the 1960s or even later. The hotel room becomes a high-security holding cell. The guards become armed. The disappearance becomes more dramatic. This evolution tells us something important. The man from Taured is no longer just a story. It's a modern myth. Modern myths don't rely on ancient gods or monsters. They rely on bureaucracy, technology, and systems we trust. Airports, passports, maps. That's why the story works. It doesn't ask us to believe in magic. It asks us to believe that systems can fail, or that reality itself might be misaligned. Interestingly, there is a real historical case, often confused with the man from Taured, John Zegras. In 1959, a man was arrested in Japan carrying a fake passport, claiming he was from Taured, not Taured, allegedly a territory between Egypt and Sudan. He was charged with passport fraud, tried, and convicted. Records exist. His case is documented. Some researchers believe the man from Taured's story is a distorted retelling of the Zegras case, embellished over time and relocated geographically. If that's true, then the mystery dissolves into exaggeration and misremembering. But here's the catch. Zegras did not disappear. His documents were identified as fake. His case had a mundane ending. Which means we're left with a choice. Either the man from Taured never existed, a myth born from misattribution, or there was another incident entirely, one that slipped through the cracks of record-keeping and resurfaced only through rumor. And that brings us back to the recurring question that refuses to resolve. Why Taured? Why that specific location? That specific certainty? It's possible the answer is disappointingly simple. A story shaped to sound plausible. A name chosen because it feels vaguely European but unfamiliar. A narrative refined through repetition. Or it's possible that the truth, whatever it was stranger than the records we have access to. Some mysteries survive not because they're unsolved, but because they resist being simplified. In the final third of this story, what matters less is whether the man from Taured was real, and more why we keep telling his story. In an era of GPS, biometric passports, and constant surveillance, the idea that someone could appear from nowhere, challenge the map itself, and vanish without explanation feels almost nostalgic. It reminds us that certainty is a relatively recent luxury. And some mysteries refuse to stay contained within a single video. And if you're carrying a theory, a doubt, or a detail we haven't explored, the comments are where that story keeps unfolding. So perhaps the man from Taured isn't a traveler from another universe. Perhaps he's a mirror. A reminder that history is written by records that can be lost, erased, or never created. That reality depends on consensus. And that sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that sit just beyond verification. Not demanding belief, only curiosity. Somewhere between France and Spain, Andorra still exists, quietly unchanged. And somewhere between fact and fiction, the man from Taured still waits at the customs desk, passport open, asking a simple question. How can you be so sure I'm the one who's wrong? And if that question stays with you, then the mystery has already done its work. When you're ready, the next story is waiting just one assumption away.